Buonasera a tutti, benvenuto all'Istituto Italiano di Cultura. This is the second talk of the series Italian Creators of Our Time, curated by Maria Teresa Cometto. And this second talk is with Federico Faggin, an Italian physicist, inventor, and entrepreneur, widely known for designing the first commercial microprocessor in 1971. But most importantly, in 1968, while working at Fairchild Semiconductor, he had also created the self-aligned MOS, silicon gate technology, that made possible dynamic memories, non-volatile memories, CCD image sensor, and the microprocessor. And I hope that tonight I could understand better what this MOS is. He received in 2009 National Medal of Technology and Innovation, the highest honor the United States confers for achievements related to technological progress. In 2011, Faggin founded the Federico and Elvia Faggin Foundation to support the scientific study of consciousness at US universities and research institutes. In 2015, the Faggin Foundation helped to establish a $1 million endowment for the Faggin family presidential chair in the physics of information at UC Santa Cruz. So please welcome Federico Faggin and Maria Teresa Cometto.
Thank you all for coming in a busy New York evening. Thank you, Federico, for flying here while it was snowing yesterday from Silicon Valley. Well, we'll try to talk in plain English and have a lively discussion, not only about science and technology, but also about more philosophical and also practical things, right? Michael Malone, author of the book The Intel Trinity, says that Intel 4004, the microchip that Federico created, was what launched the digital revolution that has changed our lives. So you understand how important this is. But before talking about the microchip, let's start with the very beginning of your story, Federico. When you were 11 years old, you were playing in the countryside near Vicenza, the hometown of Federico, and what happened?
Well, it was actually in Vicenza, near the home that we were living at that time, and I saw a model plane. And for me, it was a revelation because how can a toy fly? I mean, only big planes can fly. So in my imagination, this was nearly impossible, but I was captivated. So I started running, trying to figure out how can it fly? What is it made of? And and it was a transformational experience for me. And when I went home, I decided to build myself one. And so I did that. He couldn't possibly fly. He violated every law of physics known to men. And but then I found the same guy. It was an older guy, probably was 18, but for me it was a old man. And he said, "Come here, show me." So I showed him my contraption, and he started laughing. He said, "You shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have done that." And then he suggested that I buy a book. So that was the first book that I bought with my own money. I think the title was Il Manuale dell'Aeromodellista Moderno, the manual of the modern model builder. And I read it cover to cover, and then my third plane that I designed myself flew, And that was the beginning of an important chapter of my life.
So that episode sparked your interest in technology and in physics, right? And that's why you chose to go to a technical school instead of going to a liceo. Was it that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, well, my interest in airplanes was already there since I was, 4 or 5 years old. I remember being really captivated by airplanes. And I wanted to build airplanes. I wanted to design and build airplanes. So, and I couldn't wait to become an engineer. I had to, to take a shortcut. And the technical high school in Italy in Vicenza, offer a perito aeronautico, which is a degree that allows you, many designer of airplanes in Italy came out of that school, actually. And there is a 5-year program. You study 40 hours a week, and anyway, so I did that. I think there is a few schools like that in the U.S., mostly in New York, I believe. But anyway, and that was against the grain of my father. My father was a professor of philosophy at the Liceo Classico, and also a libero docente, which is a PhD. He wrote about 40 books on philosophy. And so, I was just the black sheep of my family.
A disgrace. So after you graduated from high school, because it was high school, you started working, right? And you were already able to build a computer. You actually built a computer.
I designed 60% of a small computer, built it with 4 technicians that worked for me, all older than I was.
And you were 19?
I was 18, 19, yeah. Yeah, and I completed the computer, and I was just turned 20 at Olivetti, at Borgo Lombardo, which is near Milan, the very beginning of the Olivetti adventure in electronic computers.
But very soon you realized that it was not enough, that you needed more education, and so you decided to go and to study physics at the University of Padua, right?
Yes.
And maybe there are some alumni here from Padua?
There you go.
Yes, there you go. By the way, the chairwoman of the alumni in New York unfortunately couldn't be here because she's in Italy. Beatrice De Bacco.
Okay, yeah, I met her. I'm in the board also of the alumni association in Padua. Yeah.
So how did Italian education help you in your life?
Well, I had a great education, not only the high school, but also university. Physics was very difficult. I don't know now. I think it's still quite difficult. Nobody would graduate in 4 years, which is the minimum time. Typically 5, 6, 7 years for a typical student. I was the only one that graduated in less than 4 years, because I started in January and I graduated in October of the before completing 4 years, and with 110 lode, summa cum laude, and but I loved it. I really loved it, and I studied the last 2 years in particular. I studied much more than the program required, because I loved it, and I really wanted to understand how things work. That's why I did physics instead of engineering. I wanted to understand quantum physics, because that explains transistors and all this stuff that I saw was coming in the future. And that was really a great preparation. When I came in this state in '68, I could have done anything, So I was
with
really
that preparation.
With that preparation, absolutely.
But you stayed 1 year teaching at the university, and then you decided to quit and go and work for a startup. Why were you?
It's too slow for me. I mean, the university I was too bad. I mean, I couldn't stand it not to get to do stuff, to get going. So I decided, no, this is not for me. And I didn't like the environment where to do anything you had to beg for money, and then then it takes a year to get money, and then they don't let you spend it. I mean, forget it. I mean, just no, let me get out of here. So,
And so you ended up working for a joint venture with Fairchild. That was a very famous company in Silicon Valley, probably the first one starting.
No. I work for SGS Fairchild in Italy.
Yeah.
It was not a joint venture of Fairchild, but Fairchild had an investment, and they own 30% of the company. And SGS Fairchild, which is now called ST Micro, is one of the largest semiconductor companies in the world still. It was the only semiconductor company in Italy, and I worked there for about 9 months, and then I came
to Silicon Valley in 68, as you said.
Yeah.
What was your first impression of that environment of Silicon Valley more than 50 years ago?
Well, you know, I don't know if you know Agrate Brianza. That's where I was. And Agrate Brianza in winter, with the fog that you cut with a knife. I mean, it was like going to heaven. I mean, I came here, I came to the US in California in February. There were, you know, flowers, and, you know, trees already in flowering and so on. It, for me, was like, my God, this is something different, something else. And also the people were very different. You know, in Silicon Valley in those days, even today, but in those days, many were engineers. You know, they were people that came from all over the US and the world. Therefore, they were people that were like me, you know, foreigners. But we immediately were welcoming to everybody. Where in Italy there was closer society. I couldn't have any friends there in Agrate Brianza. You know, I was kind of I was a foreigner there, more foreigner in Agrate Brianza than I was in Palo Alto. So it was for me it was a major improvement.
And it was there at Fairchild that you created this Silicon Gate technology,
Yes.
a milestone in the tech industry.
Yeah.
It's too complicated to explain what it is, I guess.
No, I can try for 1 minute if you like. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the transistors are the elements of a computer. You know, they are the fundamental units. They are, in a computer, they actually behave like a switch, you know, a switch that you turn on and off the light, except they turn on and off so much faster than you can turn it by hand. Or a relay is also a switch controlled by an electrical current that turns on maybe 1,000 times a second. The switches that we use now turn on and off about 1 million billion times a second. So a little faster. And in those days, though, they were turning on and off more like in 1 microsecond, 1 millionth of a second, maybe 1/10 millionth of a second. So I developed a device called MOS, metal oxide semiconductor, that instead of using aluminum, use silicon. This allowed to make the devices smaller, faster, and much cheaper. And that was the technology that changed the industry. And within about 15, 20 years, the transistors made with silicon gate, as opposed to metal gate, took over the entire industry and displaced the bipolar transistor, which was a different type of transistor that was used primarily in those days. So it was a sea change, and they are still more in use today. So.
Yeah. However, Fairchild was not really able to capitalize on this invention.
Yeah.
And you were kind of impatient. You
always
must be
impatient.
You
I've
must
always
be
been impatient.
always impatient. But how come that a company can have a fantastic research lab and not being able to become commercially profitable?
Well, it was the beginning of the end for Fairchild, actually, not having embraced the silicon gate technology. The company that did embrace it was Intel. Yeah. There was people from Fairchild. They left Fairchild to start Intel, and they took the technology that I developed, and they pretended that they developed it. That's normal in business. And so Fairchild Intel started with the silicon gate technology. They were the first to actually offer, except for my integrated circuit, there was a Fairchild device that was sold at the end of 1968. The first device other than that with silicon gate was Intel. The first memory of Intel was called the 1101. Was a 256-bit RAM, random access memory, that was introduced in 69, toward the end of 69. So that's, and so that technology was a technology that allowed Intel to become a dominant company. And then after that came the microprocessor, which was another my invention there at Intel. And then they pretended that I didn't do anything for them when I left to start my own company. But that's another story.
Talking about the founders of Intel,
Yeah.
One was Robert Noyce,
Yes.
so-called mayor of Silicon Valley, they say.
Yep, must.
Yeah. And Gordon Moore, the author of the famous Moore's Law,
Yes.
The one that says that every year the number of components
Doubles.
doubles.
Yeah.
No.
For the next 10 years, he said.
Okay, okay. So how exciting was it working with these people?
Well, they were definitely luminaries. They were people that understood what was happening, but not as much as they are made to be, because obviously, for example, Gordon Moore did not believe that microprocessors were a particularly important thing. Noyce did. Noyce supported the microprocessor, but he was a little concerned too. I actually pushed them a lot early on to actually go out and sell it, because they were custom devices early on. They were not designed to be products for everybody. They were designed for a single customer.
Yeah, you were trying to solve a problem. They had a problem with the work they had to.
Well, there was a
deliver.
customer, a Japanese customer, that wanted to have a set of chips to make a family of calculators, top desktop calculators. So they went to Intel, because Intel had the only technology that was able to make, that would have been able to make a fast enough microprocessor. They have a chip. They had a quote-unquote microprocessor designing 3 chips. So they already had the idea, and of course the idea of having a CPU on a chip was already discussed.
CPU stands for?
CPU, Central Processing Unit, which is the key element.
The brain of
the computer. The computer has essentially a CPU, a memory, and some devices to connect with the outside world, like a display or a keyboard and so on. But the key piece that was still missing was the CPU, because the memories existed already, but the CPU was not in a single chip. And you need a single chip, because only with a single chip you are fast enough to be able to solve a variety of problems with a computer. Otherwise, the computer is too slow, and then you can only solve a small class of problems.
And how did you arrive to your eureka moment?
No. The story is actually stories are always a little more complicated than people would like it to be, unfortunately. But the story is that this company called Busicom wanted to design a family of chips. There were 7 chips, of which 3 were they would make a CPU. But a CPU with memory that was in those days serial memory instead of random access memory. So it would have been much slower than what could be done. Intel in those days was developing the first dynamic random access memory, the 1,000 bit. By the way, 1,000 bit in 1970. Now in your pocket you can have a flash memory with 256 gigabyte of memory, which is a chip, has 1,000 billion transistors in one chip. 1,000 billion transistors in a chip. And you have it in your pocket for $40. That's the progress, Moore's law, but not doubling every year, doubling every two years. because it slowed down, and then now they double every 3 years. But that's what has happened in this industry. All using silicon gate. They're all these memories use silicon gate.
Yeah, and so you succeeded in building this computer on a chip.
Mm-hmm.
That was the definition, right?
Yeah, it's a CPU on a chip. Then you can put memory and create a computer on a chip. So, but the key the more difficult element is the CPU. So once it was possible to put a CPU on a chip, then within a few years we could put all the memory and have a computer on a chip.
Yeah, and when you saw that it worked, you signed this chip with your initials, F.
Of course.
FF. Why? I mean, it's not very common.
Well, because the layout of the 4004, to me, it looked like a work of art. And every line it has a function, but it's also beautiful from the, if you look at it under the microscope, of course, because if you look at it with your naked eye, you don't see anything. But if you look at it under the microscope, it's beautiful. If you take a picture, it looks beautiful. So I sign my work of art.
There are engineers or people who do art on chips.
Yeah, there are, but then it doesn't have to function. See, the point is that here is something that's beautiful and functions. That's a lot more, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, but then just 3 years later, again you left Intel and you started your first startup.
Yes.
Right? You left because you were not satisfied.
Look, it took me 9 months to convince my bosses to do the 8080, which was the first high-performance microprocessor. I had to work actually harder to convince them to let me do what I came up with. I said, never again. Why should I spend all my life, convincing people to do the right thing? I'll go do it myself. There you go.
And so you became what they call a serial entrepreneur because
Yes.
you founded the 4 or
No, 3.
3.
I ran 4 companies, but I started 3.
3 startups. One startup is the one that created also the touch
Touchscreen and touchpad.
the touch screen. So
Yeah,
if you have your
those
iPhone
things,
with a touch screen,
We invented those things also.
Yeah. What was the name of the company?
Synaptics.
Yeah, and all the big companies, including Apple,
About
have bought.
$2 billion company. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it's a small company here.
So, what does it mean being an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley?
Better than being a serial killer. Sorry, I didn't mean it. No, serial entrepreneur is you see, if you have ideas, entrepreneurship is the only way to take new ideas into the world. Because when a company gets too large, they want to conserve. They don't want to take risks. Mm-hmm. So if you have a new idea that is, you think is revolutionary, you got to go start a company. And that's why entrepreneurship flourishes in Silicon Valley through the startup. There are not large companies. Large companies grow typically by buying startup companies that have created something new that they couldn't create internally, and so they grow that way. Mm-hmm. Because they are financially powerful, but not imaginationally powerful. And so it's essential to have a mechanism to create innovation through the energy of people that are creative and they also have a passion about what they do, which is essential to make it.
Many Italian young people, many young Italians who dream to create their own startup, they go to Silicon Valley to try to learn how to do. Is Silicon Valley still the capital of innovation?
Absolutely. I mean, just think for a second, Silicon Valley even innovated in cars. Tesla, which is the first real electric car, not a car like another car where you bolt in an electric engine. No, You start with a fresh piece of paper and you design a new electric car like you should. Tesla was the first real electric car. It's a Silicon Valley company. And if you had asked me 30 years ago if there would be a startup in cars in Silicon Valley, I would say, you're out of your mind. No, you know, that's biotechnology, in new areas that in quantum computers now, and all, I mean, you keep on going. I mean, now in AI, there are probably, in Silicon Valley this year, the investment in AI, chips
artificial
for AI.
intelligence.
Artificial intelligence. Probably $2 or $3 billion just in 1 year, and just in that segment. So.
Yeah, before talking about artificial intelligence, which is a hot topic, one question about China.
Yeah.
China plans to become #1 in technology in the world. What do you think about this challenge to Silicon Valley?
Well, it's a fundamental challenge because, first of all, Chinese are very smart. They work very hard. They have a huge number of scientists and engineers. 45% of the kids that go to university study STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In the US, 5%. So that tells you something. There are a lot more, therefore, engineers there than here. And they are absolutely dedicated to doing it. So I think it's more than a challenge.
Something to take seriously.
Very seriously.
Mm-hmm. So going to artificial intelligence is one of the hot segments of the tech industry everywhere, and especially in Silicon Valley. Yourself, some time ago, you thought that you could build a computer as intelligent as we humans are, and then you gave it up. Can you explain what happened?
When I started Zilog to make cognitive chips 30 years ago. So what people are trying to do now, I was trying to do 30 years ago.
What does it mean, cognitive chip?
A computer that can learn, computer that learns. As opposed to be programmed, it learns.
By itself?
Using neural networks, which are artificial neural networks, which are similar to the biological neural networks that we have in our brain. And so, but because the computers in those days were not fast enough to do this, I was designing a computer, I was trying to design a computer using analog circuit, where with one transistor I could do a multiplication and an addition, instead of having, say 1,000 transistors. So I would reduce that by a factor of 1,000, and they were much faster. So, but I could never, and we succeeded in building neural networks, and we had, I actually had a chip that could read checks, but every chip had to be custom. I could not find a general purpose architecture like a computer, so that with a small number of chips, you could develop many different types of cognitive computers. So I had to give up. I gave up, and we developed the touchpad instead, which of course was good, and then this touch screen, which, so the company did okay. But the first 5 years, I was absolutely dedicated to developing a cognitive computer. And it was at that time that I started asking myself, but could I make a conscious computer? The idea in those days, and still today, is that consciousness is a emergent property of the brain, of a complex system. So the computer is a complex system. Can I make a conscious computer? And so I started thinking about that. And I thought and thought and thought, and after 3 years or so, I came to the conclusion that no, I don't even know where to start because the key thing is that consciousness is about feelings, is about meaning, is about something that you had to convert from symbols, which are electrical signals, biochemical signals. How do you convert from electrical signals and biochemical signals into feeling, sensations, meaning? Nobody knows anything. And today, nobody knows either how can you do it. So I started studying consciousness on my own, because that's the only thing that I only know my own consciousness. I don't know if you're conscious, but I know that I am. And for the same for you. You don't know if I'm conscious, but you know that you are, right?
How would you define to be conscious?
The capacity to perceive via sensations and feelings, to have an experience, a sentient experience. So the capacity to, in other words, a computer, no matter what we do, right? No matter what we do, we have an inner world of sensations and feelings and meaning. A computer, there is nothing inside. There is no feelings, nothing. Is a action reaction, but action reaction like a car, a gear that engages another gear. That's it. The gears are, instead of being made of metal, they are electrical signals that move, but that's about it.
Yeah, trying to make examples.
Yeah.
So talking about feelings and emotions.
Yeah.
What about this new frontier of the artificial intelligence called affective artificial intelligence? There are programs now that teach a computer to recognize the feelings of human beings and to react consequently. And there are already startups, applications, and so on used in marketing and I don't know in which other.
Yeah, those are all imitations. In other words, a computer that imitates a conscious behavior. So, for example, if I'm angry, my face will have certain grimaces, which can be recognized as, you recognize them, okay? The computer can recognize it. You give them example, you say anger, and the computer then generally is able to recognize anger in the face of a person. Is a conversion from one symbol, which is the look of your face, into another symbol, which is the name anger. That's a symbol. The name anger is a symbol. There is nothing in between. When I see your face, and if I detect anger, inside of me there is light. There is an experience. I experience and I ask myself, but why is she angry for? What's going on? Did I do something wrong? But whatever, something which goes on inside of me, my consciousness. Because to have an experience, to experience something, as opposed to having action-reaction, you need consciousness. Consciousness is the capacity to have an experience. And that's fundamental. And we are so used to it that we think that, well, computers should have it too, right? That's exactly what I thought 30 years ago before I started studying this thing. And then having extraordinary experiences of consciousness that told me that what actually is true about consciousness goes way beyond our ordinary experience of consciousness.
But many people in Silicon Valley don't agree with you, right? They have a different idea of artificial intelligence.
Not in Silicon Valley, in the world.
In the world, okay. Maybe also here, so we will have a discussion about this. So what's wrong with that? What can be the consequences of thinking that the computer, the robot will...
But the consequences of thinking like people think today is that we are machines. I mean, science is telling us that we are machines, in fact. And I'm not behind the bushes. I mean, that's what typical scientists think, that we are machines. And I say, no, we are not machines. We are also machines, but we are much more than machines. So if you want to be a machine, believe them. If not, find out. In other words, don't take their words for it. Don't take the words of the scientists that tell you that you are a machine. And that the computers of the future are going to be better than you because they can play Go better than the champion of Go. We do a hell of a lot more than playing Go. Any game that has rules is much, much simpler than the game of life that has no rules, where also people are after you. They're trying to kill you. They're trying to destroy you. The world, if a computer had to really, try to fight over people that are trying to kill it, I think the computer will come out skated.
Anyway, you created your foundation, the Federico and Elvia Faggin Foundation, exactly to study consciousness.
Yes.
How this foundation work?
Well, basically, we give money to centers that are studying consciousness, however, only from the viewpoint that consciousness may be a fundamental property of nature. In other words, science studies consciousness as if it is either an epiphenomenon, meaning it doesn't even exist, it's not even real, or it is an emergent property of the brain. Therefore, when you die, consciousness is gone, because consciousness is not primary, is not a fundamental property of nature. I reached the conclusion after 20 years of studying it, 10 years ago, that no, consciousness is fundamental. In my view, consciousness exists already at the level of the quantum fields of the elementary particles. So a quantum field of electrons is conscious. Physics studies quantum fields as if they were things, as if they were energy. And you can get a lot of information that way, but that's equivalent to studying us as pure machines, which is exactly what science does. Since they cannot study the inner reality of us, because they can tell if I'm angry by looking at my face from the outside, but they don't know the meaning of my anger. The meaning of my anger is my personal, private knowledge, and that they cannot get by any outer measurement, ever. So that's a very fundamental problem. So consciousness is something that we all have and that we frankly don't cherish enough, because it's what distinguishes us from a computer. A computer simply is a machine. It is made of pieces that you can take them apart and put it back together, and the machine works. You cannot take the atoms and molecules of a cell, take them apart, and then put them together and get a cell that works anymore. Because a cell is a very different, fundamentally different physical structure. It's a physical structure that breathes in and out matter, transforms itself throughout its life, is in a completely symbiotic relationship with the environment. So it is something that is today science studies as an object, but it is not an object, it's a field. It's exactly like a quantum field, even a cell. It exists, what exists is a pattern that changes from birth to death, that fills in with matter, that continuously flow through this cell. We are the same.
Yeah, so we are touching quantum physics, which
absolutely,
is
quantum
really
physics is fundamental.
Yeah.
That's why cells are very small,
yeah.
because the phenomena that makes a cell exist are quantum phenomena. Mm-hmm. And cells, up until recently, have been studied as classical physics, not even quantum physics. Now, for the last 10 years, there is a new field that is just emerging called quantum biology. And quantum biology, there are probably 100 people in the world now that study quantum biology, claim that biology is based in a fundamental way on quantum phenomena, which of course, to me was obvious 30 years ago, but now they are really putting money in studying this. And that's fundamentally different.
What is your goal? In the end, do you want to demonstrate this theory, and what would it look like? Like a formula, like what?
Well, in the end, I want to convince the end for me is when I go the other side, but I don't believe that's the end of me, by the way. The end of my body, yes, but not the end of who I am. And when I go the other side, what I would like to do, to have accomplished, is to have 100 of the smartest young people in the world, not in the US. The US will be one of the countries but Europe, Asia, 100 of the smartest people, they will believe that what I'm saying has sufficient truth to actually explore it. so that they, my work will be multiplied by 100. That's it. And the key idea is that consciousness is fundamental, is primary, is irreducible, is not an epiphenomenon, nor is it matter. And in fact, quantum mechanics today is beginning to show that even our experience is unique. In other words, in the quantum domain, we can make an experiment where a coin, a quantum coin, that has two faces, an observer says, I see head, another observer sees, oh, I see tail. So this is happening in quantum physics today. And if quantum physics is the foundational physics of living systems, which I believe, and you will see, the young people will see in 10 years or 20 years, that I was absolutely right in saying so, because it's so obvious. It's too obvious. Is that it's hard to do. So people studying as classical systems, because quantum systems are much more complicated. So you will see that that what I'm saying is correct, and therefore all the reality that exists within quantum systems is the reality of living systems, because we are a coherent aggregation of cells. Our body is coherent aggregation of cells. That's why we have one consciousness made of many sub-selves, sub-consciousnesses, in turn made of many subconsciouses, and so on, all the way down to the quantum fields of matter.
Let's
Is
take, let's
Take a breath,
pause,
take a breath.
Exactly. And go to something
Lighter.
lighter. And before
Dinner.
no, before our friends here can ask you questions. A couple of questions about Italy.
Yeah.
I know that every year you spend some time in Italy. You give lectures at universities, you meet researchers, you meet young entrepreneurs. Have you noticed any interesting new trends in Italy during the last few years? And I don't know, would you invest in an Italian startup?
I found a few young people that are actually trying to start up some companies and so on, which has always been there, but in some cases, these are people that had an experience here, so they understand what it means, and they have come back to try to do that in Italy, which is a good thing. However, if they don't find funds, which is very hard to do in Italy, that is not going to work. But you have to start with the spirit of, I want to do it, I want to try it.
And you've noticed more of this spirit?
I've noticed a more, an awakening. It's small, because there is right now in Italy is a little, it's lost a lot of momentum in the last 5-10 years. So I mean, that's my impression, and so I think and I hope that this is the beginning of an awakening of the forces of change in Italy.
And in your opinion, what could Italy learn from the Silicon Valley ecosystem in order to grow again?
Well, to understand that intrapreneurship, which, by the way, has always existed in Italy. Veneto, my region, was full of small companies started by people that were designing different kind of machines, different kind of foods, and what have you. So, but they did not have the scale to actually generally to grow beyond a mom and pop shop, and so what to learn from Silicon Valley is that you have to have an ecosystem with real money to support the winners, so that you can actually create companies able to compete in the global economy. Because today we compete in the global economy. You can no longer, serve a small market. You have, and also to do certain things, you need a lot more money than is possible to have from a small startup.
So finance and venture capital are really important.
That's right. But
yeah.
Unfortunately, the people that have tried in Italy in the past have not done well, and so then what are you going to do? So they wait until there is some winner, then maybe people will go in. So is a chicken or the egg, and the real breaking of that cycle is if someone is able to show that in Italy we can do, some young person typically, do something great and make a lot of money, and then the VC will follow the money. Typically, that's what they do.
Okay, for the time being, I stop here. Thank you, Federico, and it's up to you now to ask questions. Okay, first one. There's a mic.
So first of all, thank you. This was the most inspiring talk, and it was only when this talk was announced that I learned that my first computer's CPU was designed by someone 2 hours drive away from where I grew up. So thank you for organizing this event. My question is, have you seen anything that could be used to measure consciousness? I've seen some interesting experiments that I can discuss with you afterwards, but I would like.
Yeah, there is the only person that had tried to do this is called Giulio Tononi. He's a professor here in U.S., but he grew up and was in Italy, and Giulio, who I know, has developed a theory which has a lot of things that I agree with. But he claims that he's measuring consciousness with his theory, but in reality is measuring the complexity of a classical system. So, and I've had discussions with him, and he agrees with me that it should at least be the complexity of a quantum system, which is different type of complexity. And but he also agrees that perhaps saying that that's a measure of consciousness is going too far. In other words, I don't think that you can measure consciousness like you measure, goods and services. But you can measure, though, the complexity of the symbol necessary to communicate the meaning by the entity that is conscious that has that meaning. So if I have a meaning, I have an idea, I have to communicate it. I must take that meaning, that idea, and transform it into a symbolic form. That symbolic form can be a sentence, a book, a mathematical formula. It could be a construction. It could be a new computer, a new idea of a new computer, for example. So those are all symbolic structure made of matter that another person can understand. The meaning that I have inside myself cannot be communicated directly to another person. It has to be mediated by a symbolic structure. Okay? So, in other words, the symbolic structure it works like a mental enzyme, lowering the barrier of comprehension to people, because you see it intuitively, you understand it. But if I have a meaning inside of me and I don't, and is invisible to others, how can I translate it? That's why reality has these two aspects, an inner aspect and an outer aspect, because we are social beings that have to communicate with each other, and our inner reality is impossible to communicate without translation in symbols. So matter is this, is the ink with which our comprehension is written.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, so in the past 150 years or 100 years, we made unbelievable progress in technology. I mean, things that might have been completely unforeseen. So I have a provocative question for you. So, A, what do you see happening, let's say, 500 years from today? I mean, how far technology will go and how threatening the evolution of technology could be to our conscious, or to modify the way the cells react and absorb the reality around us and transform those impulses in reactions. And I just wanted to make a side point about Italian companies that are too small to compete. There are actually many companies that are very small, but they're able to compete on a global basis just because they are small, as long as they are number 1 or 2 or 3 in their own small niche market. And they are the backbone, as you probably know,
Yeah.
of our economy. But
Yeah.
that was just a side point.
Yeah, definitely.
you.
But unfortunately, it would take a lot of small companies to be able to make a dent in a overall Italian economy, and we have lost many of the large companies in Italy, unfortunately. So that's not enough. Certainly, that's something to build on. But also, if we want to stay on the subject for one more second, is that Italy needs to understand how to manage large companies, not as a family business, but as a more objective business. Because very often the Italian companies, they are started by a visionary, and then that person takes his children or his relatives and so on. And if those people don't have the same passion and capacity of the father, the company goes down the tube, unfortunately. And that has happened a lot in the Veneto, for example. And so it's important to create companies that can really withstand generations. So the question of the provocative question has a provocative answer. So the way I think of it is that if we don't take action in the next 20, 30, 50 years and become aware of our humanity, meaning we're conscious beings that are not machines, and consciousness is primary, I don't think humanity will exist in 500 years from now as we think of a, large, humanity will probably self-destruct. It doesn't mean that men's will disappear, but it will be a start over game. That would be my assessment. In other words, we are in a very dangerous course today because technology is outstripping our capacity to use it responsibly, but by a long shot. And so technology in the hands of some mad people is dangerous, particularly if that technology makes boom, like atomic bombs and so on. We have come with in the Cold War with Russia, we have come a few times close to mutual destruction. So that is something to think about. And when you have people that govern that becomes a little too easy with power, you have a problem. And so that's a big issue. So 500 years from now, our consciousness has to evolve much faster than it has evolved in the last 500 years in order for us to cope and use technology intelligently. That's my... Well, technologically... Well, clearly, there are things that people have been working for the last 40 years or so that, like quantum computers, for example, which are able to process information much faster than any computer made with the physical matter that we know, with the properties that we know. In fact, nobody knows how a quantum computer can actually do what it does because the operations don't happen, the actual computation doesn't happen in this world. It happens in some other reality, which is not this world. In this world, we get the answer, but not the computation. So that's already telling us that this world is just a surface reality of a deeper reality where, for example, quantum computation is going on. So quantum computers are
There are a few big companies that are working.
They're not quantum computers. They call them quantum
No,
computers.
they are trying to build them.
Oh, yeah. No, but there are companies saying you can buy a quantum computer for us, but those are not programmable computers. They're like the early analog computers that we used before the digital computer. So they are basically they are emulators of a quantum system. So you set up this structure to create a model of another structure, another quantum structure, and then you let it run, and they will be very useful actually to learn about living systems, because you can begin to play with more complicated systems than you can do with classical computers. But they're not the quantum computer that is programmable like a conventional computer, which those are more like 20, 30 years in the future, and they may be 50 or 100. I think they will be done. They will happen. So 200 years is definitely within the frame. I mean, the robotics and automation will reach levels that of which of which people are talking today. For example, self-driving cars, they will exist, but not in 5, 10 years like they tell you, but more like 20 or 30 years from now, but they will happen. And the reason is simple, because because most accidents are caused by people that are not in their head, properly in their head, like they are drunk, or they are drugged, or they are disattentive, and so on. So there is a good reason for having self-driving cars, and the investment so far has been so huge that the results also good enough to see that it will occur. So, so before the self-driving car will revolutionize transportation. Transportation is about 20% of the economy in the US, and so it's a major area of our life, and that will completely change. The ecosystem of transportation will completely change with self-driving vehicles. So that certainly will happen, no matter what will happen. The biology will eventually see the light and see that biological systems are quantum systems, and that will be a major step forward. They will have tools which are quantum computers to study that classical computers cannot study that. They're too complicated, and so that will make major inroads. So if mankind in general understands that consciousness is fundamental and develops that aspect, 500 years from now, the world will be very different and much better than it is today. So.
Thank you for being here. I commend you on the clarity of your presentation and your thoughts. But as I think through them, there are some lapses which I'm sure you have already thought about. I would just like some further clarity. So you're describing a system of consciousness that is intrinsic, I suppose, subatomic level, maybe electron, sub-electron level, wherever the other dimension of the electron goes to. And you're saying that there is a barrier that we essentially cannot see or pierce right now, but fundamentally we are already leveraging it to get some results which we can use in the real world, if I'm following correctly.
That's correct.
A collective consciousness has occurred, ironically enough, based very much on your work, right? And so we clearly are in a situation where we all have our individual consciousness as we classically observe, and yet because of this bigger conscious, which we these days call the internet, there is a feedback effect where you see individual consciousness transforming with the bigger feedback loop that is creating, and then changing the bigger feedback loop.
Yeah.
So behind this barrier, so to speak, the question is, are these consciousness always individual and technology can only gel them so that just the communication is happening between this consciousness? Or somewhere behind this barrier, perhaps, might we discover that just like on this side of the barrier, now the consciousness have been able to merge to exert as a singular consciousness of some kind.
Yeah.
Behind the barrier, is that innate? Is that intrinsic?
Yeah. See, that's a good question. The consciousness of internet there is consciousness in internet, but it's not coherent in the sense that it's like the consciousness of a stone. A stone is, if I say consciousness is primary, consciousness is in the quantum fields, not in the electrons, by the way. The electrons don't even exist. Okay, so many of you will scandalize, but that's exactly what top physicists are telling us today. And that's, and I believe that electrons are our imagination, how we imagine a state in a quantum field. So the conscious entity has to be vast. It cannot be a tiny electron. A conscious entity, or the fundamental in this world, is a quantum field. And the particles are states of a quantum field. That's what advanced physicists say. So as quantum fields combine and create let's say, a quantum field of electrons combines through communication with a quantum field of protons, it creates a quantum fields of hydrogen atoms, right? So the hydrogen atom actually is not an object, is actually states of fields linked internally. What is that link? The link is actually what is it called in physics? We call it the name will come back, but it's basically a fundamental property. It's a non-local link that connects elementary particle. It's entanglement. It's called entanglement. Okay, so now an atom of hydrogen now is actually conscious as an atom of hydrogen. At the same time, the quantum field of electrons and protons remain conscious. So is a new emergent entity that is conscious that exists in the original fields as states that are linked by entanglement in the original fields. And we also exist in those fields as unbelievably complex structures of states that are linked together, okay? And that linkages is what, that linkage, there has to be a certain type of linkage to create from lower level entities a higher level organization that is conscious as an organization. A stone has only links, internal links in the crystallites and the other elements that are embedded in a stone, but it's not conscious as a stone. There is not an entity that has free will and the capacity to act as a stone. Only living systems have one entity that controls the living organism. So internet will be like a crowd of people that are communicating in a square. They are all together, they all communicate, but they all have little groups that communicate with each other, and there is not a overall linkage of all these individuals to create one entity that has one will of its own that can control the entire internet into a particular direction. That's the difference. Is that clear? Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
you'll go deep, more deep after.
In hearing you talk about studying consciousness and talking about tools for studying consciousness, do you believe that we have, with science, with the scientific method, a good enough tool, or do we need a new Galileo?
We need, that's a good question. We need to extend the reach of science, because science up until now is based on third-person experiments. But consciousness is a first-person reality. I know that I'm conscious, like I was saying earlier, but I don't know if you are. In other words, I cannot, with an external measurement on you, even if I do an fMRI and so on, know if you are conscious. But I may say, yeah, probably that person is conscious, but I don't know anything about your inner experience through an outer measurement. So how how is it possible to extend science to study first-person experiences properly? That's something that actually will come, but it might take 50, 100 years to occur. And it will come because scientists are beginning now to recognize that the individual experiences are subjective. There is no objective world out there. And that's what quantum physics is saying now. And the first experiments are now telling you, you see tail and I see head. What's going on here? What kind of a world do we have where your experience is different than mine? We cannot even agree on some what we thought was objective reality. That's what's happening right now. But it's just beginning. Before it becomes an important movement, it will take another 30, 40, 50 years. So, and because of that, then science will have to face the problem of consciousness. Right now, they just brush it off because they don't know how to deal with it yet. So I hope, but before I die, to have, working with a top physicist, theoretical physicist, to create the methodology of science to deal with consciousness, which is not the same methodology of science that we have had so far. Has to be different, has to be broader, has to contain the existing methodology, but cannot be just that. So.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you for all your wisdom. So in response to your comment before about how technology is advancing more rapidly than we can govern it responsibly, if you are a business leader today, a CEO or an executive at a company, how should you be thinking about technology? It's what every business is focusing on, but how do you focus on it in a responsible way? Yeah.
It's a tough question. I mean, because if you run a company, you are, particularly if you have a public company, for example, you have, a CEO has to respond to the investors, right, to the shareholders, and so, it has a limited amount of freedom in straying into what could be considered early on a kind of a, this guy's getting too soft, and so to have CEOs that are really that have a level of humanity, if you want to call it that way, that is way beyond the average, is hard. And there are some that often they are in private companies because they don't have to respond to anybody. And there are people that have a responsible attitude toward the products that they make, the materials that they use in their products, and so on. And so if that example is followed, it will be the way to go. But it will take time, because people here typically only look at results. If you make more money, that justifies being not particularly responsible, for example. So, but on the long run, I think the responsible behavior is the one that will outlast the irresponsible one. But it has to become a culture. Okay.
One last question.
Society is still functioning with religions. And the consciousness you are talking about, in fact, is something that was developed also thanks to sciences and from the Enlightenment and so on. So can this kind of consciousness coexist with the reality as it is today? Or, she mentioned Galileo. Galileo means a kind of revolution. And revolution, there are different kinds of acting in revolution. In a way, it's not that I have a fear, but it could be a drastic revolution. What do you think about?
Well, the science and religions have coexisted up until, let's say, 50, 75 years ago, nicely under the umbrella of Descartes, the dualism of Cartesian dualism. In other words, Descartes had a theory that mind and matter are separate entities, and so science studies matter, and religions the mind. Okay, so it was a pact of coexistence. But I'm trying to, if I'm correct in what I'm doing, and that will require the union of science and spirituality, not religion, because religion generally is dogmatic, it's not scientific. And so there is no ability to change your mind if you made a mistake. The religions have to stay firm on the principles, and they are dogmatic, and that's not the way to go, because spirituality, on the other hand, is about inner experiences, inner experiments. Physics is about outer experiments. If reality is a irreducible reality of inner and outer, of meaning and symbols, which is what I propose, all of a sudden, they had to come together. And in fact, what happened was that quantum physics showed that the universe is holistic. Holistic means that mind and matter as separate parts cannot be real. So that's why the Cartesian dualism today is dead in science. I mean, before people were kind of giving the benefit of the doubt, but now it's dead. So now we have to find a one solution that unites two aspects of us. The inner aspect, which is intuitive, is based on meaning and so on, and the outer aspect, and of course, is also rational, and the outer aspect, which is symbolic.
Well, I think that we could go on for hours. we can go on in small groups later, but before closing this fantastic, really inspirational conversation, there's a scoop for you in anticipation. Nobody knows this yet, that very soon a book by Federico Faggin will be published in Italy about your life and these ideas and everything, right? It will.
That's correct, yeah. It will be published in May, June timeframe.
And hopefully also then later in America,
in
English.
I have the English version ready, so that
excellent. So we will have another.
It was written in English, in matter of fact, but then my wife took the liberty to translate it and edit it because it was too long, and so I have you know how wives can make a zigzag in your life.
Hopefully for the better.
For the better.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Federico.
Thank you.